I'd like to welcome everyone to the historic Masonic Theatre tonight. We're fortunate to have best-selling author Beth Macy with us, and I'd like to thank the Clifton Forge Public Library, the Friends of the Library, and the Masonic Theatre for making this event possible. If you get a chance after Beth's presentation, as we're enjoying some refreshments, please go ahead and thank them for it. I personally would like to thank American Airlines for bringing Beth and me together again. We both ended up on the same flight to Charlotte back in June in adjoining seats, go figure. I knew Beth many, many years ago, and it was a delight to discover that I was sitting next to her on the airplane. One thing led to another, and she graciously agreed to come speak to us tonight. We're going to all be very grateful for what we're going to hear tonight. So I appreciate your attendance, and we're looking forward to what Beth has to say. It's really hard to know how to introduce Beth. She's a longtime reporter for the Roanoke Times, and her 2 books have been reviewed amazingly well across the country, both out in paperback. She's the winner of numerous writing awards, as well as a Neiman Fellowship at Harvard in 2010. Factory Man, her first book, is the story of John Bassett's successful attempt, to bring his furniture manufacturing back to full production in the face of globalization. True Mind, her second book, which just came out in paperback a couple of weeks ago, is the story of 2 African-American albino Muse brothers who were taken to perform for the circuses and traveled around the country. Her third book has a working title of Dope Sick, and as you can imagine by the title, it is about the opioid crisis, focusing on 3 communities here in Virginia. Beth will be signing books after her presentation, and you are invited after Beth is finished to go to the back room, help yourselves to refreshments. Remember that Christmas is coming, so buy books and keep Beth writing. Please welcome Roanoke's own Beth Macy.
Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay. Well, thanks so much. And thanks to the historic Masonic Theatre. We've been out on a book tour for the paperback recently. It came out about 2 weeks ago, and we were in Bend, Oregon last week, and they were saying that their revitalization that happened about 2 decades ago out there was specifically tied to the renovation of their historic theater. So, and it was just a beautiful place and a beautiful turnout, and the town is booming, and I'm wishing you all just the best luck with this project and with the town. I did a little bit of reporting in and out of here when I was a 25-year reporter at the Roanoke Times, and I've always enjoyed getting to come through, especially Averil's store and the cheeseburgers. I was so sorry to read about Granny. I remembered the little handwritten ledger where you could charge your hamburgers, and just great. And was able to write about Joan when her first novel came out, and so of course I know your city manager Darlene Burcham, a formidable force in Roanoke, Virginia, and largely responsible for the growth in Roanoke as well. So I know you all are in good hands here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. Thanks for that introduction, Joan. That was fantastic. These books are both about outsiders from rural America who were sort of underestimated at every turn. They're very different stories. John Bassett was a third-generation furniture maker who was born to inherit Bassett Furniture and then didn't get to do that in 1982 when he was kind of kicked out by his wily, very smart, kind of mean older brother-in-law. But he did okay. He likes to say, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth and I had no intention of taking it out. That's just one of his good lines. He's got hundreds. The hero of True Vine was a black maid, illiterate, never learned to read, born into sharecropping. Her parents were slaves. And yet she's every bit as gritty as John Bassett and also is underestimated at every turn. Both books cover about 110 years of history, from agricultural to industrialization to globalization. They both they both address themes of labor, exploitation, greed, racial history, and they both feature people a lot like me in some ways, and that is sort of an outsider and underdog myself, although I would never put myself in quite the same league as John Bassett and Harriet Views. I like to tell people who I am, who I was. I'm the daughter of a dislocated factory worker. I grew up in a little town in Ohio where the company that ran everything, including the town, was called Grimes Manufacturing. And my mom was soldered airplane lights when the economy was good, and when it would tank periodically, she would pick up under-the-table jobs, babysitting and waitressing, badly, she said. And I was the first person in my family to go to college. I went solely on federal need-based financial aid, mostly Pell Grants, a few small scholarships, and I worked 3 jobs. I feel really, really fortunate to have been among some of the last people in America that come from a group of promising poor kids who actually get to go to college at a time when a Pell Grant would pay the full freight for college tuition. It's pretty hard to do today. I grew up with a love of reading. I grew up about 3 blocks from the library, so I'm just thrilled that the library is a sponsor here. My grandmother lived on that side, and that's our house on the right. She owned our house. She kind of kept the family together, literally a roof above our heads. My parents weren't very well educated. My dad dropped out of school in 7th grade, but they were great users of the library, and they loved reading. They would each of them read 3 and 4 books a week. So I wrote for the Roanoke Times for 25 years. I quit in 2014, right before Factory Man came out. And the stories that always did the best, that seemed to resonate with the most readers, that would win an award, were stories that were about outsiders and underdogs, funnily enough. And it took me a while to figure that out. And then once I figured that out, I tried to always be proposing those kinds of stories. So some of the stories, if you're readers of the Roanoke Times, that you might remember are, other than my great piece on Avril Store. But I wrote about refugees from Africa. I wrote about immigrants from Honduras and Mexico. I wrote about veterans with PTSD. Factory Man actually grew out of a series I did on the economy when the recession hit in 2008. I did this ongoing series called Making It, in which I would one week profile families that were doubling up to stave off homelessness, and maybe the next week profile somebody who's growing their own food. Probably my favorite story I ever wrote. It ran on a Thursday. It wasn't a big deal story, but it ran on the front page. And it was a story I had been chasing for almost 4 years. And I had first met this young woman. She was 14 years old, and she was a library page at the Gainsborough Library in Roanoke, which is a predominantly African-American community. And her mother had been a page at that library. Single mom, raised her. And when I first met her, the librarian pulled me aside. I was doing some research for a story there, and the librarian pulled me aside and said, "You need to keep your eye on this one. I know you're always looking out for good story ideas." And so whenever I would have a book, you know how you can get a book delivered to a different branch, I would have it delivered to the Gainsborough branch, just as a way to check in on Selena. And so by the time Selena was a senior, she was #1 in her class at William Fleming High School. She was reared in the projects of Roanoke, pretty rough environment. But she had this really strong single mom that raised her, and she had the love of this library community. When she was a sophomore, people would put quarters and dollars in a jar on the counter to help her go to France with her French club. And so, not surprisingly, Selena had gotten into every college she had applied for. But I knew there was one she was really waiting for. And so I was there at 5 p.m. on the day when she was going to find out whether or not she got in. And at 5 p.m., she checked her email, and it was there. And she was not just going to be the first person in her family to go to college. She was going to be the first person in this particular neighborhood. And she got a full ride to Harvard. And the whole place erupted. The whole place erupted. It was a beautiful moment to witness and then to get to tell other people about. And that kind of story is still my jam. Like, that's the kind of story I love to do. Old men who were at the newspaper, who were at the library reading their newspapers. Because why would you buy the newspaper? You just go to the library and read for free, right? Put down the newspapers they were reading at that moment when Selena got into Harvard, and they wept for history.